Well, what I'd love to talk about, the future of cities. How do you see the forces that will shape the city of the future? But if architecture is about improving the quality of life, then surely this is right at the heart of architecture. How do we effect that revolution, that transformation? Could I kind of launch straight in? You're involved in the future of cities, coming at it from a somewhat non-design level. How do you see the forces that will shape the city of the future? I mean, if we're talking about, let's say, the end of this century.
Well, first of all, I mean, it's interesting you say not at the design level, because how I understand the economy is through design, how I think of design, which is that nothing is deterministic. We have currently designed government structures in the wrong way, designed corporations in the wrong way, and especially designed their partnership to be too kind of parasitic and not really symbiotic and mutualistic. And so if you look at markets themselves as outcomes of all those design features, that's the kind of market we get. And we currently have the wrong kind of markets, I think, the wrong kind of capitalism. Anyway, cities, I think, are interesting. I'm not a city expert, that's for sure. Cities are very much at the front end of many problems, but have not been equipped with the tools. I mean, even if you look at how budgets are prepared, or the autonomy that city mayors have on their budgets, it's not what they need in order actually then to tackle, whether it's the test and trace system, whether it's a proper COVID recovery, whether it's global warming. So I'm interested in kind of backtracking and saying, what are you trying to do? What are the problems you have? And then how can we design every single thing you have at your disposal, from procurement policy to literally the so-called partnerships, the kind of public-private ecosystem, in order to deliver solutions to that problem, versus subsidies, guarantees, loans, schemes that bring in capital without any idea of what are we even trying to do.
Yes, I'm fascinated by the role of public and private. I take it that you wouldn't agree with Mike Bloomberg and Carl Pope in their book Climate of Hope, which suggests that climate change and the issues in terms of cities and cities are the future is too important to be left to government, that city mayors and administrations and academic institutes should take the initiative. I have my own views on that, but I'd be curious to know what yours are.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what they said there, but for sure what you need is a very different type of government. And as I mentioned, a very different type of relationship with businesses, but especially a different type also of corporate governance structure. So it's not about like, whose role is it? Is it government? Is it the mayor? Is it businesses? Is it civil society? Is it the big society, as Cameron tried to convince people, which kind of made really key social concerns outcomes of charity, philanthropy, which I don't believe in. I think philanthropy is not the way to solve problems. We need proper structures on the ground, proper production, proper innovation. But again, it comes back to governance decisions. So, one of the things I'm doing actually with Bloomberg Philanthropies is setting up a new kind of executive education program for mayors. Because the institute I've set up in London at University College London inside the Bartlett, it's called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, basically tries to argue that it's not enough to say that policies need to improve or to say the state needs to do more or less. We need to ask ourselves, what is the state doing? And why have we accepted this kind of bullshit idea that at best policies there to fix market failures? Because that has then trickled down into the curriculum, literally the textbooks that global bureaucrats read and are examined on. So, this idea that the market is out there, it sometimes fails, and the role of policies to fix market failure, filling the gap. You're always too little, too late. Whereas if you take this idea of co-creation and co-shaping of markets between both public and private, then one of the questions is, what are the capabilities? What's the capacity you need within public institutions in order to co-create, in order also to be a good partner to the private sector and vice versa. And so the current curriculum, that basically came from Chicago school economics, which some people just call like neoliberal economics, but I think that's a bit too vague, has come down in the form of new public management and public choice theory that has not only convinced civil servants they're there just to fix markets, but also to be aware that government failure is even worse than market failure. So take up as little space as possible, do your thing, and then get out of the way. Whereas if you look globally, the dynamic public institutions, both those that got us the internet, not bad in terms of making our smartphones smart, GPS, touchscreen, but also the BBC, really active, ambitious, innovative public organization. DARPA got us the internet, the Navy got us GPS, the BBC is a very creative kind of public institution. Most renewable energies have come from public actors. That's one just fact, historical fact. But then the next question is, what do they need within their organizations to be kind of investor first resort, a market shaper, which crowds in business activity, given that business is often dependent on or relies on someone kind of taking these early risks, early stage, high capital intensity. But also businesses tend to invest when they see an opportunity. This idea that you just need to make things cheaper, is not right. Business doesn't invest because something's cheap. It invests if there's, interesting expectations about future market and technological opportunities. So really, I think what city mayors should be trying to do is to have really ambitious, what I call mission-oriented public policies, which make their cities really cool places for capital to invest in the long run, in order to do interesting things with other businesses, but also with the public sector. So in Denmark, for example, Copenhagen, because it wanted to be, one of the greenest cities in Europe, they ended up basically fostering a whole startup scene, which today is providing high-tech digital services for China's green economy. And China's spending over 3 trillion on greening their economy. And the little country Denmark is servicing the high-tech digital services for that. And that actually came out of mission-oriented city policies. So I just think, we need to go beyond this dichotomy of it. Is it entrepreneurs in the private sector? Is it public policy leaders? It's really about how can we shape the opportunities that make it ambitious and interesting to invest in a city, but to solve, social problems.
Yes, I mean, I think that the thrust of this book was that government is too slow to act, and therefore this was a plea essentially for the private sector, for cities, to be able to make change happen faster. But wouldn't you perhaps agree that what you need is both? You need a balance between the public and the private sector.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I believe. But also, you don't get that if you have this kind of ideology which just continues to say government is too slow. You end up with the government that you believe in, right? So if we believe, as I was saying, that the government is at best there to fill the gap, so even public spaces are simply filling the gap of where private space doesn't exist, or public investment is filling the gap of where private investment doesn't exist, you will become slow, because you are no longer within your organization thinking of yourself as a value co-creator, a value shaper, and hence not asking yourself, what are the capabilities, the capacity that I need within my public organization to be dynamic, creative, think out of the box. So I just wrote a book called Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. And the whole point was like looking at what happened within NASA, the space agency, when it was actually interested in getting to the moon and back. The first thing they did was change their organizational structure, because they were too siloed, too top down, too slow, using your word, too bureaucratic. And so they realized that, partly that was also the Apollo 1 fire kind of woke them up to that. So Gus Grissom, one of the 3 astronauts, yelled before dying, like an hour before dying, because he couldn't hear what was being said. He's like, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings inside NASA? And that's the truth in most government departments. They don't even talk between each other. They're all working within their silos. And to solve the kind of problems we have around climate, health, inequality, you need to be working between silos. You need to be also investing in your own capacity to think creatively, out of the box, via creative bureaucracy. And so if you do look at the kind of successful public investments, they came out of organizations that thought, or at least interrogated, their own intra-organizational dynamic. So there's nothing in the DNA of government that means that it will definitely be slow, like you just said, they say in their book. That's just dogma, that's ideology. So we need to go beyond the ideology and ask, what kind of government structures do we need? What kind of private structures, and how can they work together, as you're saying correctly, in dynamic, ambitious, and symbiotic ways in cities, but also nationally and other regions.
If we just talk a little, perhaps, about trends, the pandemic, I've suggested that in the short term, it will seem as if the pandemic has changed everything. In the long term, I've suggested that all it will have done is to have magnified and accelerated trends that were already apparent. Would you agree with that?
So it depends. I mean, for example, because it's highlighted such failures, we were not able to deliver personal protection equipment, which is not exactly rocket science, to frontline workers who we were then clapping on Thursdays, right? Complete insult in a condescending way. Yes, you're essential, but sorry, we can't protect you on the front lines. So I think that woke many countries up to just what weak kind of local capacity. We have production capacity to deliver pretty basic goods. The vaccine also is a big wake-up call. We have the vaccine, and that's not easy. That was very hard on the scientific side, but we didn't deliver it globally, which is what you need during a pandemic, right? You need it to be globally accessible. So we didn't have the kind of solidarity. We didn't have the right intellectual property rights, which continue mainly to be designed, coming back to that word, in a way that just extracts value and doesn't foster collective intelligence. We also have a digital divide. I've got 4 kids. They kept more or less having their access to their human right to education during lockdown. Many kids globally, even in London where I live, didn't because of the digital divide. So I think these very stark lessons have been huge, which have started to make, I think, hopefully, praying, change occur on precisely all those levels. So for example, you start hearing the return of industrial strategy, and that you can't just outsource your whole capacity. In Italy, for example, where I'm from, we outsource 100% of capacity to produce personal protection equipment to China. So when the pandemic began, we were completely reliant on an external source for PPE. And even though procurement policy is really inertial and static and basically not exactly a funnel of innovation in Italy, due to the pandemic, they ended up using procurement in a very dynamic way that Italy just hasn't done in the past. And they ended up fostering 137 local company capacity to produce what is now 100% of Italian PPE locally. Why? Because they embedded within the contracts also of these relationships between public and private certain types of conditionality that allowed also a bit of a nudge and a push with the private sector to also deliver what was needed, but they obviously received huge benefits for doing so. Whereas so many different types of public-private partnerships in Italy, and I can say this because I'm Italian, are kind of parasitic, often kind of predator-prey, just raining subsidies and guarantees with no condition of what are we even trying to do. And I think that's been, I've seen that in many different parts of the world, but also there was a real wake-up call on how our own, again, civil service had itself been outsourced. In the UK, you might have heard a Tory lord in the UK government, Lord Agnew, said that he looked at just how much the UK government had outsourced its capacity to companies like Deloitte, McKinsey, PwC for both Brexit and COVID. And he said that was infantilizing Whitehall. Again, big wake-up call for change, of stop just outsourcing your brain to the big 4 consulting companies, invest within your own civil service. So hopefully all of these are sort of wake-up calls that if we actually care about solving problems, climate change being a huge problem, but even all these different problems I've mentioned are very concrete day-to-day problems, which have made the pandemic much harder than it had to be. Hopefully this will be a wake-up call to reversing the trends around the consultification of government, reversing the trends around the digital divide, because it's just been so obvious that during a lockdown, you can't have a digital divide. But also conditionality in another way. In France, for example, the finance minister put conditions attached to the COVID recovery funds that were provided to both Renault and Air France, that they had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions over the next 5 years. And that was a condition for the COVID-19 recovery in France. Whereas in the UK, we just gave EasyJet a big kind of bailout with no conditions attached. So again, the kind of discovery that there's different ways to recover. We can build back better, but that's only going to remain a slogan unless it's into the design of the contracts.
What you're, I think, suggesting in one sense is that there will be a lasting legacy of this COVID. And that is a rebalancing of the local and the global. How do you see that relationship between globalization and, for want of a better word, localization?
It's a good point. So I think we need to be careful not to use those words in a way that are too abstract. So for example, coming back to the UK where I live, you needed a national plan. And unfortunately, that's been, I believe, but this is all subjective, I think it's been quite weak in terms of kind of planning forwards and having a plan that has also been clear for citizens and for companies and so on. But you also needed really local capacity to govern the plan. So for example, the vaccine, it's not just, again, the science and the vaccine itself, how it was rolled out really ended up relying on local capacity. And that's when it was successful. In fact, you might know that initially we, again, outsourced things like test and trace to Deloitte, but the vaccine was luckily, in terms of its rollout, which has been very successful in the UK, it was done through the National Health Service, but through its local GP practices. And because there's a real trust between local GP practices and citizens, at least, and by citizens, I mean it in the Aristotelian sense. Luckily, the NHS is available to all in the UK. Because it was built on, the GP practices are at the community level, they are decentralized, there's a decentralized network of different practices across the UK. It's a national system, but it's decentralized at that local level. I think that's a really interesting case study as kind of a model to scale up across many different areas, right? So you need a strong health service, but how it's governed, how it's distributed, how it is then enacted for a crisis like this really makes sense at the local level. And I think the same is true with, many different battles around global warming and climate, and coming back to your first question around cities. On the one hand, cities will be stronger if there's a really clear national agenda around, say, the Green Deal, the Green New Deal, sustainable transition kind of policies. But how it then occurs, how it gets rolled out, has to be embedded within structures that are kind of real and co-created also with citizens. So for example, in Camden, where I live in North London, I'm chairing the Camden Renewal Commission, and we're implementing the mission-oriented approach that I've worked on and kind of helped develop in Europe at the local level. And one of our missions is on clean growth and around using housing estates, so social housing, the estates in Camden, which is one of the largest, I think it is the largest council actually in London, choosing some estates that are kind of going to be the funnel for these carbon neutral and global warming missions. But that requires bringing the residents in the housing estates to the table and citizen assemblies to the table to talk about what does it mean to live together in a more sustainable way. That has to happen at the local level. That has to happen literally at the estate level. You don't just feed people, your solution to how to live a better sustainable way. They have to be part of that if it's going to stick, if it's not just a pet project of a minister of some sort. And so I think that constant, kind of global and local and national kind of intersection. So you begin with the global sustainable development goals. They land in a country and have to be, voiced and created in such a way that makes sense for that country. So developing versus developed countries and so on. But then as you go down each kind of area of more granular unit of analysis at a city level, the advantage of cities is it makes it easier, I think, to bring, these different voices to the table, both because of the size of a city, but also because cities are constantly interacting with people who live in the city on really concrete problems, like how to get from point A to point B. Or again, these issues around social housing. So I think using social housing, public transport, public education at the school level, for example, with school meals. This is another area we're working on in Camden. Healthy, sustainable, tasty school meals, using these as funnels for green innovation at the local level, but addressing a global goal, which has hopefully had leadership at that national, level.
Yeah, you've talked about the physicality of some trends. We've seen, surprisingly, an acceleration of the growth of the pedestrian domain at the expense of road surfaces. We're also aware of imminent changes in terms of robotics, changing attitudes to ownership by younger generations, a greater embrace of ride sharing, of on-demand services. If you put these various trends together and you kind of looked at your crystal ball, decades into the future, how does your imagination see the city of the future in more physical terms?
It's interesting because, no one would think that Google is free or public just because it's free, right? We can all access Google, but it's not a public resource necessarily. It's open to the public, we can use it, but you wouldn't call it necessarily a public good because of all sorts of issues around how it's actually governed, right? And I think the same thing at the city level, just because a square or a space is free to walk in or is free to walk through. I'm thinking of particular new public spaces in the part of London, again, where I live, like Granary Square behind King's Cross. It's not enough that I can walk through it, that it's not, gated. That doesn't make it a public space. How do you actually govern public spaces to be what I will call, again, purpose-oriented, to really try to foster the kind of, engagement between people, or make them also what Oliver Eliasson and we had a very nice conversation. He's an artist. I know you know him because I think I actually met him in Madrid for your wonderful conference back in 2017. He, in a conversation we had for his brochure, for his retrospective at the Tate, where he interviewed me, we were talking about kind of public space, private space. And he said he thought public space should be designed in such a way where people feel safe to disagree, right? So think of it, all the different challenges I've been talking about, whether it's climate, health, digital divide, and so on. We're not all going to agree on what to do. And really kind of designing public spaces as places where people feel free to experiment together, to disagree, to debate. That needs to be fostered with some level of kind of design thinking. And it's not enough just to say, okay, you can walk through this square and it's a public space. I'm actually also talking to Francis Morris about this, about, what is the role of a publicly funded museum in order to kind of foster that kind of engagement, debate, and disagreement in a safe way. So I think, to answer your question, in a world that's so full of polarization, just think of the whole kind of, Trumponomics in the US or Brexit in the UK, which really just created a lot of disagreement, but not really in a kind of harmonious way. It was just disagreement, period. And we all remained in our position. And at best, just say, let's not talk about it because I don't want to fight with you. We need to think about whether in the future, how are we going to reduce this polarization? How will we actually come together precisely to find solutions to the biggest problems that we face ahead? And I think the more that cities, but also design thinking, architects, designers, urban planners can be really kind of central to that in terms of creating spaces to reduce that polarization, while at the same time creating a debate and a discussion of what we want to do together in that proactive way, not just a defensive way of what not to do, the better.
Our conversation, not surprisingly, is focused on a particular segment of society. There is a parallel reality where 14% of humanity live in slums, informal settlements, however you describe them, with inadequate shelter. They don't have access to clean water, sanitation as we know it. And that, if unchecked, is by prediction likely to be 1 in 3 by 2050. How do you see addressing and reversing some of those trends?
So I think first we need to understand what the cause is of that level of inequality, because that's what it is, right? We need to, it's inequality which is not inevitable. It's not, again, deterministic in the system. Globalization doesn't have to lead to slums. Robots don't have to lead to unemployment in certain sectors. We can, in fact, together, it's not just about public policy. It, again, relies on much commitment also from the business community, but I always come back to that issue of how they relate one to another. There could be, you can imagine, very bold missions to solve many of those problems. I saw it happen in London. I don't know when the last time, because I think you live in Madrid. Is that right? Or both? No, I don't know where you live. Okay, I live in London.
a number of different places, let's say.
Okay, so the last time you were in London, I don't know when that was, you might have noticed we have a huge amount of homeless people.
Yes,
so I
absolutely.
moved to London. So I'm Italian, but I grew up my first 5 years in Italy, then moved to America and moved here 20 years ago. The amount of homeless people in London, I've been living more or less in North London for the last 20 years, has escalated a lot. I mean, you just see,
Absolutely.
right? During the lockdown, they disappeared. We housed all homeless people because it was seen as an urgent priority, right? So we cared. By we, I mean society, and then we can break it down to what it required. But it was mainly, again, out of policies. It was not acceptable. It's never acceptable. But all of a sudden, people woke up to it. It is not acceptable during a health pandemic and during the lockdown and with all the deprivation, especially in the winter months, but not only, to have that level of misery on the street, which we should never have. But it was resolved within months. All homeless people were sheltered. In Camden, hotels were used by the council to not only house homeless people, but to bring them services, mental health services, obviously nutrition, obviously shelter, but all sorts of different services, of which, again, mental health is such a crucial one, to the place where they were being housed. So kind of a one-stop shop welfare state, right? You can imagine learning from that and then kind of scaling it up at a national level in a more systemic way, in a more continuous way. But we tend to only do things like that under kind of urgent pressure. But anytime we go to war, no one ever says, oh God, we can't go to Afghanistan. No, we can't go to Iraq or Iran. There's no tax revenue. We can't do it. We find money. Every country finds the money to go to war. And now with the COVID recovery funds, as you know, in many countries, in many rich countries, money's pouring out just for the recovery after maybe just some years of saying there was no money. And many developing countries where many of these slums and favelas exist, but let's not forget the equivalent of that in many developed countries, also have budgets, right? They're just often being misused. Procurement budgets, I've already mentioned, are a large percentage of every government, whether it's in Africa, Latin America, or Europe, percentage of the total government spend. If you don't use the power of government budgets to solve people's problems, it's a wasted opportunity. Unfortunately, we only make money appear, again, during wartime scenarios or when it's kind of too late during a pandemic, which is ravaging across the globe. So this is why I really believe in kind of focusing on the problem. So imagine if the problem that you were setting yourself was basically to reduce the need for a slum, to eliminate favelas, to eliminate, again, digital divides, especially for those kinds of children who are living in real deprivation. You could actually bring together all sorts of different actors and sectors, public, private, civil society, different sectors in the business community across the economy, come together to solve certain problems. But it's not going to happen just by saying, oh, let's work together, we can solve the world's problems. It needs to be designed into the industrial strategy, into the innovation policy, into your design of procurement, into the design of how you think about a Green Deal. So the deal bit is just as important as the green bit. And, I've seen enough places like in Vietnam and Kerala, for example, where during the COVID pandemic, they did so much better than so many developed countries and developing countries because they actually had this approach, which was, again, mission oriented, but on the back of really investing within their own public administration, because they realized that with their previous pandemics, like the Nipah virus, they just didn't have that capacity and they didn't have a trust between civil society, government, academia, and business. And so we need to learn from places like in Vietnam and Kerala in India, or Camden Council, which I'm learning a lot from, how things were done when they went well, really listen, learn, and start experimenting around different ways of of experimentation, because I believe in trial and error, but then scale up the lessons, like that lesson of the one-stop welfare state for homeless people that Camden went through.
I think it's a great note to end on. It's really optimistic. It's also a great note to start another conversation, another beginning. But thank you so much. Really appreciated it.
Thank you, Norman.
Thank you.